Imagine this scenario. You are the CEO of a major American defense contractor. One day, the IT lead for the company walks into your office and says, "We're under attack." He tells you that a host of intruders are trying to break into your system using very sophisticated cyber methods. You ask him, "Who is it?" He says he doesn't know. "Where's it coming from?" "I don't know," he says. "What are they trying to do?" Again, he isn't sure of the answer. If you're a normal CEO, used to successfully managing your company, this uncertainty will leave you feeling frustrated and quite possibly even furious. But before you fire your chief information officer, consider this. His uncertainty is the reality of vulnerability in cyberspace. It's also the subject of today's lecture. As we talked about in the last lecture, the logical structure of cyberspace is a web-like one that is distinct from the hub-and-spoke structure of traditional telephone communication systems. That web-like structure is both a virtue and a vice. It's a virtue because it allows almost 100% accurate communications across the globe instantaneously. The web structure is what powers sophisticated websites like Amazon and Facebook. It's what allows you to read on your laptop the latest news from Kenya if you want to. But the vice is that the logic structure is about communication of information and data, and only about communication. It's about getting information quickly from here to there, and nothing more. That focus on rapid, accurate, and effective communication to the exclusion of every other factor, security, identity, and authenticity, for example, has made cyberspace a dangerous place. A place where people can pretend to be someone they're not, where scammers can steal from you, and where nations can go to war anonymously. Now, if we take a closer look at this dangerous place, we can identify 5 distinct features, in effect gateways, that actually create vulnerability for anyone who connects to the cyber network. Let me list those features quickly, and then we'll address each in turn. First, the internet destroys time and space. It allows almost instantaneous action at a distance. Second, the internet is an asymmetric medium, allowing actors to project force disproportionate to their size, strength, or wealth. Third, the internet allows for anonymous action in ways that are completely unlike action in the physical world. Fourth, the internet is essentially a borderless domain, with no border guards or checkpoints monitoring traffic as it crosses international boundaries. And finally, in cyberspace, the ones and zeros all look the same. They lack what we call distinction, and so we're unable to distinguish between, say, commercial information and a cyber attack. Now that you have that introductory list as a guide, let's take an in-depth look at each of these 5 fundamental ways in which the internet creates a gateway or a path to vulnerability. Consider first the idea of instantaneous action at a distance. The history of human interaction is essentially one of the increasing distance at which our interactions occur. Take armed conflict, for example. Early on in human history, conflict required physical proximity. Think of the Romans fighting at sword length apart from the invading Visigoths. You have an idea of how close you had to be in order to fight a war back in ancient times. Likewise, the sale of goods in the ancient economy. The buyer and the seller had to come physically together to trade goods. And as for malicious acts such as theft or murder, the perpetrator had to be physically close, either to the victim or to the victim's property. So too with espionage. The spy had to actually break into someone's office and steal the secret plans, so to speak. Over time, this necessity for close proximity has weakened. In the warfare context, we moved from swords to bows and arrows. Later still, we developed siege cannons and artillery. Then came airplanes that were capable of projecting force across the globe. And finally, we reached the point in the real world where intercontinental ballistic missiles were capable of reaching from the United States to Russia or vice versa, in just 33 minutes. Trade, crime, and espionage all also began to happen at greater distances. That's how we get our cars from Japan today. The internet is a quantum leap beyond all that in capability. Now, actions in the cyber domain occur at the speed of light and cross immense distances almost instantaneously. From your desktop, at the flick of a finger, you can access a website in Japan, read a South American newspaper, or even make reservations at a restaurant in Paris. But what is easy for you from your home computer is equally as easy for any malicious actor in the world who wants to access a computer, say, here in America. Whether the object is warfare, terrorism, espionage, or crime, it is no longer necessary for the malevolent actor to be anywhere near the venue of his actions. One incident makes the point. It was reported not too long ago that malicious software, probably from China, though nobody is quite certain, was found on the computer of then U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Now, in earlier times, if a Chinese spy, or perhaps it was a Russian spy, it doesn't matter, if a Chinese spy had wanted to get access to the office of the Secretary of Defense, he or she would have had to pass through several checkpoints at the gates of the Pentagon and then surreptitiously made their way into the inner sanctum of the E-ring of the building. By virtue of the structure of the internet, in this case, the malicious actor was able to penetrate Secretary Gates's computer from a distance that effectively put him or her beyond our control. So that's the first fundamental vulnerability, the possibility of instantaneous action at a distance. Now let's talk about the second vulnerability, the asymmetries of cyberspace. One of the unique features of the internet is that the manipulation of bits and bytes does not require the development of a sophisticated industrial base, nor does it really require a substantial financial investment. In other words, the barriers to entry into the cyber domain are incredibly low. More importantly, the structure of the internet is such that, at least today, the offense is, broadly speaking, much more effective than defense. As everybody knows, sadly, it's almost impossible to avoid a virus infection on your computer. Firewalls and intrusion detection systems are only so effective. What that means is that a small group of actors in cyberspace can have an incredibly large effect, far disproportionate to their actual numbers. In fact, a handful of really intelligent and effective cyber Jedis can compete in cyberspace against the most powerful nations in the world. A great example of this is the group known as Anonymous. You may have read about them. They are a loose organization of cyber activists, what we sometimes call hacktivists, who use their cyber skills to assault big companies and countries. Actually, one of their first targets was the Church of Scientology, apparently because the Anonymous members objected to the church's tactics and doctrines. And frankly, it's pretty hard to know exactly what Anonymous wants. Their goals are often vague and shifting. Sometimes they seem like political activists supporting free speech. They provided some tools in support of the Arab Spring, for example. Other times they seem like mere hackers with a pseudo-agenda of internet freedom. Whatever their motivations, they are often quite effective in their tactics. They've taken down a CIA website, for example, and stolen internal emails from sophisticated cybersecurity companies like HB Gary. They've even hacked into a telephone conversation between the FBI and Scotland Yard. In short, though they're a loose amalgam of individuals, their skills allow them to compete with some effectiveness against much larger and seemingly more powerful institutions. Other examples of this sort of asymmetry abound. Perhaps the most common is the prevalence of fraudsters on the network. I have no doubt, none at all, that everyone listening to this lecture has received an email from a Nigerian scammer offering millions of dollars as a windfall if you'll just only front a small transaction fee. If you haven't gotten one of those, then you've gotten a note on Facebook from a friend who is stranded in Lisbon or London, or so they say, asking you to wire them money. Most everybody recognizes these scams for what they are and doesn't answer. There are even, amusingly, groups of scam baiters who entertain themselves by trying to scam the Nigerian scammers. But if almost everyone recognizes these scams as frauds, why do they continue? The answer lies in the asymmetric nature of the internet. Sending out 1 million scam letters is almost costless. And even if only 1 in a million people is fooled and responds to the scam request, the disparity between the costs involved and the potential benefits to be gained from a successful scam make it highly profitable for the scammers to continue. This asymmetry in cyberspace is a radical development. In the past, there were significant opportunity costs to fraud. It required an investment of time, money, and energy by the con man. Think of how much effort, for example, went into the scam perpetrated by Robert Redford and Paul Newman in the classic movie The Sting. They operated an elaborate fake betting parlor. They used a fake insider to scam an Irish numbers kingpin. The Sting took weeks to set up. When that much effort is required, the actors want a relatively high degree of confidence that they'll be successful. Today, on the internet, that's no longer necessary. Fraudulent actors can spend literally pennies on a global scale with a realistic hope of reaping a financial reward. Another way of looking at the problem of asymmetry is through the prism of national security. In the physical world, a country's power is judged by its force of arms. A significant part of America's strength lies in its 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and the planes they carry. Few other countries can even come close to wielding that kind of power today. But the asymmetry of information power on the internet changes that dynamic. Countries like North Korea and Iran, they're perfectly capable of challenging and perhaps even dominating America in cyberspace. The limits lie not in their industrial base or the size of their economy, but rather solely in the intellectual capabilities of their citizens. To be sure, size still matters. Larger countries like America and China are likely to produce a larger number of true cyber warriors. But that doesn't mean that Iran can't find 10 truly excellent cyber hackers. And that means that, for example, as we contemplate how to respond to Iran's nuclear program, America is obliged to consider that the domain in which the future conflict might occur is one where we are not necessarily all-powerful. And so, whereas in the physical world, only nation-states could effectively compete against each other, in the cyber domain, small non-state actors can challenge nation-states, and poor Nigerian con artists can scam people on a global scale. To cite one final example, let me tell you about the botnet, known as Conficker. We'll talk more about how botnets work in the next lecture, but basically, botnets are programs that allow a single controller to send orders to a bunch of controlled computers, making them act like robots, as it were. Hence the name, botnet, which is short for Robot Computer Network. Conficker is the largest known botnet in the world, infecting an estimated 9 to 15 million computers, all under one group's control. If there are 100 people listening to this talk, it is almost guaranteed that at least one of you, and probably more, has the Conficker virus on your computer and you don't know it. And what is most amazing of all of this is that despite its extensive reach, nobody knows what Conficker will do. Though we've identified it, whoever owns Conficker has never really turned it on. Talk about asymmetric power. So now let's move on from asymmetry and talk about the third fundamental factor or gateway of internet vulnerability, anonymity. Conficker is also an example of the power of anonymity. Nobody knows who runs Conficker. This is a very disturbing fact about cyberspace. Sometimes we are not even sure we know who our opponents are. There's a famous old New Yorker cartoon by Peter Steiner, picturing a dog sitting in front of a keyboard of a computer as he says to a dog friend, On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. While that is no longer necessarily true for the average citizen, it remains fundamentally true for malicious actors in cyberspace. The internet, as I said, was not designed to require identification. Its only function, as initially conceived, was to transmit information across great distances rapidly. That made sense at a time when there were only 4 nodes on the internet, that is, 4 universities whose systems were connected, and where everybody who used it knew each other. In fact, for many years, all of the domain names on the internet were given out, in effect, by a single man, John Postel. Postel was one of the leading computer scientists who worked on the development of the cyber network, and everyone trusted him. Today, there are more than 2.5 billion nodes on the net, representing nearly a third of the world's population. It's incredibly easy to hide in that large a network. Perhaps equally fundamentally, the idea of anonymity on the internet has become part of our culture. Many users, particularly those in the younger generation, feel as though the freedom of the internet is an inherent birthright that comes with the development of the internet domain. They're wrong. It's actually part of the architecture, can be changed. But when a cultural norm becomes as strong as this one, changing the underlying architecture of the system becomes politically problematic. The phenomenon of anonymity has also given rise to a new type of actor on the internet, the deliberately anonymous actor. In fact, we've already seen that an entire group of hackers operates collectively under the name Anonymous. Working at a distance, these unknown members of Anonymous, or another group called Team Poison, are perfectly happy to attack the website of the CIA or the Department of Justice without any real fear of identification or retribution. Criminal networks also take advantage of the power of anonymity. They operate almost with impunity around the globe, stealing information and money from unsuspecting victims. One reason identity thieves are almost impossible to deter is that their own identity is almost impossible to discover in the first place. Here again, the contrast with the physical world is remarkable. Yes, of course, thieves can wear masks to hide their identity. But the requirement of physical proximity to commit a crime means that there are many opportunities, fingerprints, car license plate numbers, and the like, to discover who the crooks are. Not so on the internet. The lack of identification, what we call the problem of attribution, is one of the foundational difficulties of the network. Not only does it create the difficulty of defending yourself from unknown attackers, but it also raises a barrier to effective cooperation on the internet with people whom you might actually want to work with. After all, if you can't be sure that you know who you're dealing with, it's hard to trust them. The fact that it is probably your bank that you're talking to means that there's a possibility it isn't, and that you have to be cautious. It isn't that identification is absolutely impossible to achieve. It is, however, the case that identification is very, very hard to do. For example, in one case of cyberspying known as GhostNet, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture, it took over a year of exceedingly difficult forensic work to identify the original source of the intrusion with any degree of certainty. So now ask yourself this. Can, say, the United States wait a year before it retaliates if some anonymous individual or group or country were to disrupt, say, the New York Stock Exchange? From a political perspective, the answer is obviously no. But from a technological perspective, the answer may be we have to. Unlike in the physical world, in cyberspace, we don't know who fired the missiles. One final point about anonymity. It has an inherently contradictory nature. As we've seen, the web offers a potentially dangerous kind of anonymity. On the other hand, as we'll talk about at length in a lecture on the phenomena of big data, the footprints that ordinary web users leave are indelible, and mistakes of judgment in what one views or posts can follow you forever. The reality is that bad actors are much harder to identify and track than innocent users. So that's a perspective on anonymity on the network. Now let's turn our attention to the next feature of the internet that creates vulnerability: the lack of borders. This is probably the place where the unusual nature of cyberspace is clearest. In the real world, a smuggler must cross the American border at some point in order to enter the United States. And that's a point where entry can be subject to governmental control. By contrast, if you send an email message to someone in France, it doesn't cross the border in any single place. In traveling across the network, the many packets of data are likely to cross multiple borders, some much more than once. One packet might go from the US to Canada, back to the US, then to the UK, and then on to France. In essence, then, there are no border checkpoints on the internet. For almost every country, China being the notable exception, there is no single landing point, for example, where the undersea cables come ashore. And that means that there is no easy way to control information as it flows across national borders. There are actually no sovereigns on the internet. This is a deeply disorienting phenomenon. We're used to a world in which a sovereign nation can control its own border traffic. We monitor who enters our country and what goods are coming in. That's almost impossible on the internet and is, in a very fundamental way, threatening to the entire structure of the international community. Since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, sovereign nations have been defined by their ability to control territory and the transit of things and goods across that territory. Now, information and ideas flow across the boundaries almost without limit, disrupting settled expectations and threatening the status quo. Think of the Arab Spring and the role of the internet in that change. As a result, sovereign countries are desperately trying to recreate borders in the internet domain. To the extent they are successful, it's only because of limits in the architecture of the network. China, for example, has developed a pretty strong set of controls over internet traffic to and from the mainland. Those controls rely on the fact that there are 3, and only 3, major undersea cable arrival points for internet traffic to the Chinese mainland. With only 3 major connections to the outside world, China has a good chance of monitoring and controlling its internet traffic. Likewise, island nations like Australia and New Zealand have limited connectivity to the broader network and are more readily able to control traffic to and from their citizens than, say, France or Germany. By contrast, the United States has so many connections with the global network that they are quite literally impossible to count. In effect, every computer in America is a border crossing checkpoint, but one that's outside the control of the government. We simply don't count, much less regulate, all the cables and wireless transmission portals that are part of the American cyber system. That makes it possible, indeed likely, that information and intellectual property can enter and exit the country without anyone knowing. Just think, for example, of how much easier it is today to import child pornography into the United States across the cyber domain, where in an earlier era, anyone who wanted that material would have had to run the risk of trying to carry it into the United States, across the real-world boundary, and being subject to customs inspection. So far, we've covered 4 fundamental features of the internet that create vulnerability: the capability for instantaneous action at a distance, the asymmetry of cyberspace, the ease of maintaining anonymity on the network, and the lack of borders. The final cause of vulnerability to consider is the difficulty of distinction. All the ones and zeros in the logic layer of the network look the same. The uniformity of ones and zeros in the logic layer is what makes the magic of cyberspace information transmission possible. You can use ones and zeros to communicate anything. But that also means that different types of activities in the logic layer are hard to distinguish. In other words, you can't tell what any given piece of computer code is going to do just by looking at it. The code that actually does the harm in a piece of malware, that's called the payload. This is the executable portion of the program that tells your intrusion what to do. Once inside a computer, a program can create a web page. It can just look around. It can steal your computer data, but leave the original data unchanged. It can change that data or destroy it. It can take over the computer and order it to send spam to somebody else. Or if the computer controls, say, a power plant, it can order the computer to cause the physical damage to the power plant. Each of these is obviously very different. Some are espionage, some are theft, and some, like destroying a power plant, are what we would think of as acts of war. And that's why the problem of distinction is so difficult to deal with. In practice, for those on the receiving end, the defensive end, it's virtually impossible to tell in advance whether a particular piece of code is an innocent email communication, an espionage intrusion, or a full-scale cyber attack. They all look essentially the same at the front end. The difference only arises when the payload is executed and the effects are felt. So think of it this way. Imagine you are operating the NORAD Air Defense Command System that defends America and Canada. Now, also imagine that you can't tell the difference between a commercial airliner carrying innocent passengers en route to New York City, or an enemy spy plane, or a nuclear bomber. That would be a powerfully difficult problem to solve. You'd run the risk of shooting down a commercial airliner, or the risk of letting the nuclear bomber through, all because you couldn't distinguish between them. Now, fortunately for airplanes, we can tell the difference. Bombers look different from spy planes, and both of them in turn look very much different from a 747 airplane. But in cyberspace, we can't tell the innocent communication from the espionage program or from the malware virus. Eventually, we come to recognize them, but that is usually only after the first attack has occurred. Particular pieces of malware have unique signatures that allow us to distinguish them from innocent internet traffic, but unlike the bomber, it takes us a while to recognize them for what they are. And that means that as a first approximation, the initial attack will always get through. The only alternative, to treat all internet traffic as if it were malicious, is just too difficult and intrusive to imagine. And so you can see the scope of vulnerability on the internet. Here's the nightmare that plagues America's planners. Someday, we will discover malicious code in the innards of the West Coast electric grid. We won't know who put the code there. We won't know how it got there. We won't be able to assume that it was put there by a nation-state competitor. It might have come from some minor power like Iran or North Korea, or even a non-state actor like a terrorist organization. And worst of all, we won't be sure that we know what the code is supposed to do. The attack will be at a distance, asymmetric, and anonymous. It will ignore borders, and it will lack distinction. That's the 5 fundamentals or gateways of vulnerability on the network. And what's most scary of all is that all of this is fundamental. It's not an accident, but rather it's part of the internet system we've built, and in many ways one of the reasons that the internet has been so successful. But that means that there is no way to completely eliminate the problem, not without blowing up the internet and starting over, which nobody's going to do. Actually, one of the inventors of the network, Peter Neumann, is working on precisely that. He calls it the Clean Slate Project. It's only a dream right now, though, and until he's successful, and candidly, he probably never will be, we can only ask ourselves how, if at all, we can minimize the risks that are fundamentally inherent in cyberspace. We'll talk more about that later in this course. In our next lecture, we'll take a closer look at some of the most dangerous ways in which malicious actors exploit the internet's vulnerabilities. In the meantime, thanks for joining me.